A beautiful song, great message. The problem is, for me, it's a little high. So I'm here on a step stool back here, seeing if I can reach these high notes for you. But listen to the words. It's called Born to Love You by Scott Wesley Brown. I was made to love you from the moment I opened my eyes, from the first step to that last step, all of my life. Little hands to serve you, little voice to praise, growing up in you, Lord. All of my days I was born to love you. It's all so plain to see. Born to as you were born for me. As the days pass by me, they draw me close to you. My wrinkles are the lessons you taught me true. I was born to love you. It's all so plain to see. Born to love you as you were born for me. Time only draws me closer to you as I grow older and wiser. Each passing moment I walk in your truth. My love for you is my greatest desire. I was born to love you. It's all so plain to see. Born to love you as you were born for me. It's all so plain to see. Born to love you as you were born for me.
Good morning. It is good to know that you are out there. Although I cannot see you, you can see me. As you probably know and may not know, however, we are not having in-person worship at Central Baptist Church of Crockett, Texas today. The COVID bug bit us a little bit over the last week or so. So our transition team has decided that today, just for today, we would pause the in-person worship, do online worship only, and we are glad that you have tuned in, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. We're glad to have you with us. I want to say thank you to Leon Hunt for being here this morning to do our special music to kind of get us started. And this morning we're going to approach things just a little bit differently. We're going to try to be as encouraging as we possibly can be, because these are, as we know, difficult days. But at any rate, no in-person worship here today, but we're here online, and we encourage you to kind of tune in, keep your ears open about next Sunday. We hope to be back in person and a little more normal by next Sunday, but just stay tuned for that. Also, let me remind you, as we are in the Thanksgiving season, that you and all of us are invited to a community-wide Thanksgiving service here in Crockett. It's hosted by the churches of Houston County, the Ministerial Association. It's going to be accompanied by the Community Bell Choir, and that will be Sunday evening, November the 22nd, 6 p.m. That's next Sunday. Location, First United Methodist Church, 701 East Goliad, right here in Crockett, Texas. Again, Sunday, November the 22nd at 6 p.m., and you are invited to be a part of that. I would invite you, wherever you are, to turn either on your phone or in your copy of the Scripture to Psalm 11, the 11th Psalm. That's where we're going to be this morning, Psalm 11. If I had a title for the sermon this morning, I suppose it would be When Foundations Fail, or When Foundations Crumble. Let me just say that the context, the background of this particular psalm, Psalm 11, is almost certainly before David became king. He had already been anointed king of Israel, but he was not yet king. But before he became king, King Saul, who was king of Israel, was trying to kill David, trying to have him assassinated because he was jealous of him and was not ready for David to become king. He didn't want to give up his throne. Saul didn't. And so things were tough for David. And then he wrote, with that kind of context and in that background, he wrote this psalm, Psalm 11, and we will read all 7 verses. In the Lord I take refuge. How then can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bows. They set their arrows against the strings, to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. When foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He observes the sons of men. His eyes examine them. The Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked and those who love violence his soul hates. On the wicked he will rain fiery coals and burning sulfur, and scorching wind will be their lot. For the Lord is righteous. He loves justice. Upright men will see his face. When foundations seem to be failing, or when foundations seem to be crumbling, Saul is the king of Israel. He's trying to kill young David, who has been chosen by God to be the future king. Friends recommended that David flee to the mountains. If the foundations are destroyed, what else can the righteous do, is the question they asked David. And yet David refused to run. He affirmed his faith that God was still in control, that God was reigning, and he was confident that God watched over him and would ultimately protect him and would judge those who were wrongly trying to destroy him. Just look at the psalm for a moment. It's rather simple. It begins with a beautiful statement, in the Lord I take refuge. How can you then say to me, and then the advice comes, flee to the mountains. Things are too bad. Someone evil is trying to destroy you. Something is going on here that's not right. You must flee and get away. And David says, no. How can you even suggest a thing? I will not flee because I take refuge in the Lord. I will not flee to the mountains. I believe that the Lord is in His holy temple, in verse 4. And then he continues. Well, perhaps we can make a comparison to David's situation and our situation in our world today. Perhaps you have noticed that today in our country, in America, some, and some would say many of our foundations seem to be, if not crumbling, certainly showing some cracks. Foundations are important. They are absolutely necessary. And it seems, at least to the point of being worrisome, that some of our nation's vital foundations are in jeopardy. Our culture is coming unhinged from its time-honored values. It results in things like lawlessness, uncertainty, and moral decline. Francis Schaeffer said late in the 20th century, and he said it plainly, modern man seems to have his feet firmly planted in mid-air. Let me say that again. Modern man seems to have his feet planted firmly in mid-air. A bumper sticker, which I've seen even recently, expresses the spirit of the age. Honk if you believe anything. Now here's a note. In a world where the limits of goodness and godliness are always and always have been constantly tested, it's easy for us to proclaim bitterly, the world is going to the dogs. That's an easy thing to do. We might, as David's friends and advisors did, despair that things have just gone to the dogs. And we wonder if there's any hope that things will get better. A man named G.K. Chesterton said of the 20th century, the century that most of us were born in, and many of us still remember well, he said this: at least 5 times in the 20th century, it seemed that the faith had, to all appearances, gone to the dogs. Let me say that again. It seemed to all appearances that our faith had gone to the dogs. And then he said, in each one of those cases, it was the dog that died and not the faith. So this morning, I wonder, and I hope you'll wonder with me, what can we do to restore our nation to her godly and good foundations? Certainly, despair is not the answer. Despair will not lead us out of this place where we find ourselves. And I would suggest to you this morning that truly the foundations which sometimes seem to be crumbling are as strong as ever. Let me mention just a couple of things. For instance, God's Word is not disintegrating. God's way is not disappearing. He has not changed, and He has not moved. It is we who have moved away from His Word and thus from Him. We have ignored Him in many ways. And I speak not only of our nation, but our churches. We have gone along to get along. We have watched as people make poor choices, and we have not intervened. We have not shown them the example in many ways that they needed to see. A philosopher, a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville said this of America: "I have learned that America is great because America is good." I think there's some truth there. And then he said, "As America ceases to be good, she will cease to be great." Now, the reason I would quote a French philosopher this morning is because I believe his words speak to the heart of what we, the church, need to be in this time and this day. If we are going to be a good nation, we must have the influence of the good people. And yes, I believe that the people of the church generally are good people. Not because we always make the right choices, but because we are following the right God. So what can we do, you and I, in a practical sense? What can we do to influence our culture for good, for godliness? What can we do to influence our nation to be one which stands on the solid foundations of godliness and goodness? What can we do? Certainly, I think we would all agree that in this day and time, with all the division, with all of the divisiveness, with all of the fear, with all the things that are going on which breed uncertainty and distrust, this is a time for the church to step up and be the church in this society, in this place, in this time. So what can we do in a practical sense? I believe this Psalm of David speaks the truth to this time and these days. And so I have 5 thoughts which come directly from this psalm that we read. Number 1, what can we do to influence our culture and our nation? Number 1, we can acknowledge God's sovereignty in history. We can acknowledge God's sovereignty in history. David says, "I will not run to the mountains. I will take refuge in God." And then verse 4 he says, "The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord is on His heavenly throne." Now that word temple there cannot refer to an earthly temple, because the earthly temple at this time in history, before David was king, did not exist yet. However, it refers to God's place in heaven, His throne, His center of control over His creation and over His people. And we must acknowledge in difficult days that God is sovereign in human history. That means He has a plan for human history. He has not lost control. Now let's be clear, this does not mean that everything that happens in human events is consistent with God's plan. We know biblically from the history of the Israelite people, and just from the reasonable study of history, that humans and even entire nations often go off the rails and they deny God's plan. Sure we do. We mess up. We make mistakes. We sin. We rebel. We do so individually. We do so as a nation. But what we also must acknowledge and know is that God in His time always intervenes, either redemptively or in judgment, and often with both. And He intervenes to move history back into the channel of His divine purpose and plan. Church, Today, as followers of Jesus, let us acknowledge God's sovereignty. Let us proclaim, let us announce, let us speak the word that God is in control. He has not abandoned His creation. He is not asleep. He's not taking a nap. And we, as the church, must stand and clearly and regularly proclaim that God is sovereign and that He is in control. Number two, under what can we do to influence our culture and our nation? Number two, we can live for eternity. We can live for eternity. Same verse. The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord is on His heavenly throne. There is eternity. Man is a creature born to believe. Ecclesiastes 3:11, hearts. We do not live for today and tomorrow only. Today and tomorrow are important, but we are always reminded that there is eternity. And God examines us from the perspective of eternity. Look at verse 5. The Lord examines the righteous. Right after declaring that the Lord is on His throne, that the Lord is in His heaven, David says, and He is examining us. He reminds us that we do not live for just today and tomorrow, that there is the perspective of eternity. Seeing things from the perspective of eternity will often change how we say things, how we see things. Let me say that again because it's so important. Seeing things from the perspective of eternity will often change how we see things altogether. You remember an old song that said, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through"? Remember that? That's a truth. This world is not our final home. In many ways, we are simply passing through this time and this place. Now, sometimes we might think that this means that what we do here doesn't matter, but that is so wrong. It misses the point. It does not mean that what we do here matters less, but from the perspective of eternity, what we do here matters more. Can you see that? What we do here has an eternal value. What we do here can change eternity. What we do here matters eternally. And so, number two in my list of things from this psalm is that as the church and as individual followers of Jesus, we must renew our perspective from the place of eternity. We must begin to see things that are happening here and now from the perspective of eternity. And when we do that, we will see much more clearly, and we will understand much more fully the things that we are experiencing, because we will begin to see them from God's perspective. And He sees so much more clearly than we can see. Number three, of things we can do to influence our culture and our nation. Number three, we can stand for morality. We can stand for what is righteous. Verse number 7, for the Lord is righteous. Now there's a statement that just seems to be naturally true. And why should we even have to mention it? Because it's important. Our God is a righteous God. Our God stands for what is good and what is true. And when we see things going on around us, either from our leaders or from our peers or from our children or our grandchildren, when we see things going on around us that are headed in an ungodly direction, and when we see them headed in a direction that is away from the truth, we must remind our culture and our world and our friends that God is a God of righteousness and truth. His Word is true. His rules for us are good. They are for our benefit, and they do not change. Those rules that God has given us to live by. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not lie. You know those rules. They're good. They're for our benefit. They are to make our lives better. Not something less or boring. No, they are good. And if they were right 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, then they are still right. And what was wrong 2,000 or 3,000 years ago is still wrong today. We never need to apologize for standing firmly for what is righteous and godly. And we never need to apologize for standing against what is unrighteous and ungodly. Verses 5 and 6 remind us that those who choose wickedness and those who love violence will certainly receive the just consequences of their choices and actions. He says, but the wicked and those who love violence, his soul hates. And on the wicked he will rain down fiery coals, and burning sulfur and scorching wind will be their lot. Listen, there are consequences for choosing the ungodly path. There are consequences for choosing the path of lies. We are reminded that those who are wicked, and they choose to be that way continually, and those who love violence, and those who struggle for human power and authority just so they can use it, will certainly receive their just consequences and the choices of their actions. Let me remind us all, however, notice that it is God who will rain down those consequences and not any of us. It's easy in an evil world to want to strike back constantly. It's easy to want to call down fire, as even some of Jesus' apostles did in his time. But we must be reminded that it is God who is the perfect judge. It is God who has all of the evidence. We don't know all the truth. We don't know as much as we often think we know. And so let's leave the judgment to God and allow Him in His time to bring the consequences upon the evil and the unjust. That's number 3. Number 4, under the heading of what we can do to influence our culture, our nation. What can we do? Well, we can hold to accountability. We can hold to accountability. Verse number 5. We've read it before, but let's look at this sentence again. The Lord examines the righteous. Sometimes we think that judgment is just for the evil. Just for the evil one. Just for the bad people. But the fact is, God is examining my life and your life on a daily basis. And we need to be accountable because God is holding us accountable. We must hold ourselves accountable for the values we pass on to future generations. From this pulpit, I often mention our children and our grandchildren. Here's the point. They will be godly only if we point them to God. Our children, our grandchildren, those that will live on after we are gone, they will be godly only if we point them to God. And we do so by holding ourselves accountable day by day, living the good example before them, showing them the way, and yes,